Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight to the forum. President George Bush signed the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004 into law on December 17th. It represents the broadest restructuring of U.S. intelligence agencies since the creation of the CIA, DoD, and NSC under President Truman. Bush has called the new act historic legislation that fortifies, quote, our first line of defense against the terrorist. Will this intelligence reform really strengthen our intelligence capabilities that radically? As President Bush recently said in the State of the Union, our third responsibility to future generations is to leave them an America that is safe from danger and protected by peace. We will pass along to our children all the freedoms we enjoy, and chief among them is freedom from fear. The 243-page bill enacts many changes, including the most important, a creation of a cabinet-level Director of National Intelligence, a DNI. Under the DNI will be a principal deputy, a general counsel, a chief information officer, and a national counterterrorism czar, basically, all subject to Senate approval, and up to 500 staffers. It also creates a National Counterterrorism Center, a National Counterproliferation Center, the Privacy and Civil Liberties Board with a chairmanship and vice chairmanship. It shores up border and aviation security, increases the number of full-time Border Patrol agents by 2,000 a year for 5 years, It has new laws aimed at people smuggling aliens across the border, and it also improves airline baggage screening. So the bill was passed, and I'm reminded of a scene in one of my favorite movies, The Candidate, where Robert Redford has spent not an insignificant amount of time and money trying to win a campaign. And when he wins, he looks at his campaign advisor at the end and says, now what? It is not the end, as we know, but the beginning. And tonight's forum will explore these issues in a very interactive way with questions and answers with my colleagues here, who I'll introduce in a second. I think what's important to remember is, in terms of this being the beginning and not the end, is we had this discussion about 2 years ago with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, another major restructuring in response to September 11th. Now, I think it's fair to say that the jury's still out on the success of that department, and there's been a lot of both internal and external criticisms of where it is. So the restructuring itself is not the cure, and so I think we want to examine both the 911 Commission, its relationship internally and externally with the 911 families, and its role historically in some of the recommendations it made. So let me introduce this great panel. By the way, hi, I'm Juliette Kayyem of the Kennedy School of Government. I started speaking before, and I'm going to introduce the panelists today, a wonderful panel. First is, of course, Senator Slade Gorton. He started his long career in public service in the U.S. military, the U.S. Army to be exact. He then served in the U.S. Air Force and Air Force Reserve. His political career started in the Washington State House, where he served as a state legislator from 1959 to 69. He then served as Washington State's Attorney General for 11 years. In the early 1980s, he wanted to move to D.C., I guess, and that's where he served in the U.S. Senate from 1981 to 87, and again from 89 to 2001. Of course, as we all know, from 2003 through 2004, he served his country once again as a commissioner on the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks upon the United States, the 911 Commission, of course. We are honored to welcome Senator Slade Gorton, and the senator is fortunate to have a number of family members from the Boston area also here. Carrie Lamack is familiar to many of us who are here at the Kennedy School, a student, of course, but she is also much more than that. Her mother, Judy LaRocque, was on American Airlines Flight 11 on September 11th. After the attack, she helped found Families of September 11th. She worked with the Red Cross and the United Way for more effective and efficient aid distribution and more appropriate regulations of the Victims' Compensation Fund. She advocated for the creation of the 911 Commission and was a key in moving forward its recommendations. Aware, of course, of the trauma caused by images of death, she spearheaded a campaign to develop warnings and increase awareness of the effects of the media's use of real-life graphic 911 images. Born and raised not too far away in Framingham, Massachusetts, she attended Stanford University, where she earned her BS and also her MBA. And she's now, of course, enrolled in the Kennedy School's Master's in Public Administration program. Welcome, Carrie. So finally, Professor Ernest May. He's the Charles Warren Professor of American History in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Over the years, he's familiar to many of us as well. He's been a consultant to the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the National Security Council, and other agencies. Currently, he's a member of the DCI's Intelligence Science Board and of the Board of Visitors of the Joint Military Intelligence College. His book, Thinking in Time, The Uses of History for Decision Makers with Richard Neustadt, is a must-read for all of us and for those interested in learning lessons from the past, as is, of course, the Kennedy tapes inside the White House during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which he co-authored with Philip Zelikow, the executive director of the 9/11 Commission. For the 9/11 Commission, he served as a senior advisor and co-authored with 80 other members of the Commission staff the 9/11 report. So finally, a warm welcome to Professor May. Okay. So, question and answer format. I'm going to start with Carrie, actually.
Thanks.
Traumatic event for the nation happens, and also for you personally in ways that you would have never envisioned your life story working out. You galvanize political support for both the commission and the enforcement of its recommendations and the enactment of its recommendations. So let me ask you the first question. Now what? For both you and the 911 families, what are you pleased with where it's at, or what's next in terms of the agenda of the victims and the victims' families?
Well, I think for the families, we sort of have a job that we never get to go home from. We don't get vacation, we don't get days off, we don't get to take half days, because the pain of my mom, losing my mom and losing other family members is always there. Excuse me. So I think at this point, for some of us, 3.5 years doesn't mean that the grieving process has come to a close. Traumatic grief, I've learned a lot about it in the past few years, I never knew, is very different than other types of grief. So I think that for some families, they're just starting to get to that process. And one of the reasons because of that is September 11th hasn't ended yet for us. We haven't been able to have funerals with bodies for the majority of the victims' families. We haven't been able to get our loved ones' belongings back. That means that people still have to figure out where are their lives going. And I think the fact that it's always in our face, we went to a war in Afghanistan because of our loved ones. We went to a war in Iraq somewhat in the beginning because of our loved ones. All these changes taking place because of our loved ones and their loss, that's how it feels to us. For the rest of the country, it was a traumatic event, so there's a disconnect there. So I think for the families now, we're still a little bit in shock and trying to figure out where to go. For the families who fought for the commission and then fought for its recommendations to be implemented, it's a little bit different because we threw ourselves into government. We spent 14 months, trying to get the commission started. That was a long process, and that was not an end, it was a beginning. Once we got the commission, we had to monitor it, much perhaps to Senator Gorton's dismay and other members of the commission staff, but we were there every step of the way. So I think that took a lot of work and a lot of dedication, but we felt obligated to do it because we wanted to make sure that it was, in our view, the right commission and got the right changes. So great, we get a commission, we get these recommendations, now what? And we had to choose, as a group, do we believe in these recommendations? There was no minority report, and some of the commission report didn't have everything that we wanted in it, but we chose to back it and push very hard for the Intel Reform Bill. Some people would say that the Intel Reform Bill isn't what it should be, but we think it's a first step. And so, like you said, it's a beginning, not an end.
Carrie is very modest in her comments. Without the victims' families, there would have been no 9/11 Commission. Congress wasn't wild about creating it because Congress was conducting its own investigation. The president was even more reluctant to sign the bill because he saw it as a threat during the course of 2 years leading up to an election. Almost from the beginning, and the 9/11 families didn't like the members of the commission either. They would have liked it constituted quite differently than appointments by the partisan leaders of the two houses. And they were on our case from the day we started until the day we came out with our report. I felt that I was the most fortunate of all the 10 commissioners because I lived in Seattle. And the victims' families groups were a constant and, in retrospect, a highly valid reinforcing mechanism for the work of the commission and for the attention that was paid to the commission. And what was remarkable was that I think that they were quite surprised when we came out with a unanimous report, because there'd been a lot of, there had been some partisanship expressed during some of the public hearings. And we told them about it about 2 hours before it was to be announced, and they became immediate allies of the commissioners then. And from the time the report came out until the intelligence bill was passed in December, they were, I think, a stronger lobby for it being passed than even the 10 members of the commission were. So it wouldn't have started without them. It wouldn't have had the results it had without them. And I don't think it would have been adopted, even to the extent that it was adopted, without their ability. They had magnificent media relationships. Television and the newspapers would print or publish anything they wanted to say from beginning to end.
Well, I think to put some context on that, the reason we were on your case so much is because we had fought for 14 months.
Right.
And I don't think I can underscore the emotional experience of going down to Washington, D.C., knocking on congressmen's doors and saying, I want to know why my mother, my husband, my child was murdered. What are you doing to find out? And to have them say, well, I'm sure someone's looking into it. And then we'd say, no, they're not. We want to have this independent commission. Well, I don't think that's a good idea. Why? Well, because we need to look forward and not behind. Okay. We need to focus on the war in Afghanistan instead of on what happened on September 11th. Or, that's just too soon. So I think the experience of going into these offices and basically begging for an investigation into the murder of 3,000 people hardens you a little bit and makes you pretty cynical of what's going on. Then we went through the process of getting a meeting with the White House, which was not easy by any standard. It took faxing Andy Card about, I don't know how many times, maybe 15, 17 times, the same fax over and over again, and getting a response from him and having him send a letter. This nice big package from the White House showed up. It cost $3.87 of your money. It was taxpayers' money to send it to me, a letter that did not respond at all to the questions of why don't we have an independent commission. And so I got this letter, went into my mom's yard and weeded her garden because I was furious, and said, I'm not done yet, and called the White House over and over again, and finally they succumbed to a meeting with us. I don't know if it had any effect or not, but when 2 weeks later President Bush suddenly changed his mind and came out in favor of an independent commission, we then had to go through the process of seeing what the administration was doing behind the scenes, of not getting a commission, of working hard to not let the bill go through, even though publicly they were in favor of it. So once we had that experience, I think that we didn't trust anyone. No offense.
Senator Gordon, I want to press you a little bit on this. You are from the same party of a White House that, whatever your politics, clearly didn't want the commission at the beginning, and that put up barriers at times, whether legitimate or not, on access to information, on disclosure of information, and yet you sort of unanimously supported the commission report. What was it like? It's your party. You probably, in your commissioner capacity, wanted things that your party clearly didn't want. And if you could talk honestly, now that it's over and the election's over, about what the pressures on you in terms of that identification.
Oh, there were no, I don't think any of us felt any real pressure. Once we were, the 10 of us, Republicans and Democrats, were appointed to the commission, we were going to do the work. And I think the frustration on the part of the Republican members of the commission, joined in part by the Democrats, was the fact that the White House did drag its feet almost through the entire life of the commission and hurt the president in the process of doing so. Because I believe it's safe to say that there were close to a dozen occasions on which times we wanted access to individuals or to documents, and they originally turned it down. And we'd negotiate with them for a while and get nowhere, and then we'd go public, and the families would go public, and they'd surrender. Now, in the ultimate analysis, we got every document we wanted to see in one respect or another, and we got at least indirect contact with every individual we wanted to see. And the White House got the reputation that it was non-cooperative all the way through. Now, if they had done in the first instance what they did in the last instance in every case, it would have redounded very, very much to their credit. I am no great admirer of our brand new Attorney General, because I think he was giving the president really poor advice on what to turn over to us and when to do it. Perhaps the best example, the most recent, of course, was the access to the president and vice president themselves. We wanted at the end, we wanted to talk to the president. And after some negotiations, they said, okay, the chairman and vice chairman can meet with the president and vice president together for 1 hour. And that was their position for a long time, for an extended period of time, and it was not acceptable to us. And the last time we went public was with the proposition that that was not acceptable to us. What happened? All 10 of us went to the White House with a couple of our staff members. The president met with us for 2¼ hours with the vice president there, but the vice president hardly said a thing. He answered every question that any member of the commission had. Every single one of them. It wasn't over till everyone had asked all of their questions. Now, I think being in the Oval Office, I think it overawed a couple of my Democratic opponents, and they had members of the commission, and they had much tougher questions they were going to ask before they went there than they actually did. But nonetheless, he answered all of our questions. But hardly anyone ever remembers that now. They just remember the roadblocks that were put in our way, and it was frustrating to us. But I will say this: no one was calling us and telling us back off. Don't do it. And we had, and the ultimate troubles with getting the bill through were mostly with the Republicans in the House of Representatives, and there's a very good reason for that. I am still a close friend of most Republican senators, and at least once a month I went to one of their weekly luncheons, and they were constantly kept up with what was going on, and so by and large they were constantly supportive. Tim Romer, who was just bowed out of the race to be Democratic National Chairman, had that relationship with House Democrats, and Bob Kerrey had that relationship with Senate Democrats. But there was no member of the commission who was really in the confidence of the Republican leadership in the House, and they didn't know what was going on, and they were much more hostile to the commission, both during its life and to the bill. And if there was a shortcoming, it was that the House Republicans hadn't picked somebody who they really trusted and who could keep them up to date with what was going on. But they didn't do that. That relationship didn't exist. And not the White House. It was the relationship with the House Republicans that was the toughest.
Professor May, I want to now go to the recommendations, or at least the enactment of the legislation. When the Department of Homeland Security was created, I think Tom Ridge was announced within 48, 72 hours. Here's this thing, now here's the leader. The DNI position is still not filled. It says something. I mean, here it is, an empty post. It's not like the rest of the world is static, right? The Department of Defense Intelligence is doing all sorts of stuff. The CIA, everyone is, both historically and then also in terms of the success of the enactment of the legislation, the fact that the DNI post has not been filled, what does that say? I mean, what is that? I mean, in one sense, it's clear what it says, but on another sense, I mean, has that permanently hurt the success of the enactment of the position?
I'll answer that by saying I don't think so. But before I answer your question, I actually would like to add a couple of comments earlier. Just I think that, so far as I know, the lobbying effort with the 9/11 family
advocacy. We don't want the L word.
I'll call it what, is the most successful effort at advocacy or lobbying that I know of at any time, not just something going on right now. But it's really quite remarkable that in addition to getting the commission and to prodding the commission to get members of the House and Senate to come back in August and September of an election year, hold hearings on the commission recommendations. That was really quite remarkable. And that, just a little note on what Slade was saying, and the political good judgment of the members of the commission, in contrast to what was the political bad judgment of some of the advisors of the White House, was just transparent. I would hear the commissioners talking, and the White House counsel would have given a response, and they would all agree that they cannot hold that position. Politically, it makes no sense, and it was really remarkable. On your question that you're asking, the final bill is more vague than the recommendations of the commission. It empowers somebody to make something out of the new office. It's a little bit like the original article of the Constitution with regard to the presidency, which really gave the president no clear direction or institutional definition. So there's a problem that the person who takes this job has to define it. And it's not like even taking the Secretaryship of Homeland Security, where at least you had a sense that there had been somebody who was managing these agencies, now you're going to consolidate. This particular post has never existed before. The person who takes it is going to have to define what it is. We'll have to define it in competition. I was going to say fierce competition, but not necessarily. Competition with the Secretary of Defense and all the people around him. And that's a tough job. So there are very few people really who can fill this. I think Bob Gates was one of the people. And I no inside knowledge of his reasons for turning it down, but I know that he'd made commitments when he went to A&M that were difficult for him to back away from. But I think it has to be someone who will not easily agree to take the job. And that's one of the reasons why there's a delay. Does it mean that there's nothing to it? No. But on the other hand, it is true, since the Act only provides empowerment, it would be possible to make it an empty post if you had the wrong person in the slot.
That was the greatest struggle in Congress, and especially in the House, was watering down the actual statutory powers that the commission recommended. And is so often the case in Congress, to get something passed, you had to have language that could be interpreted in more than one way. And I agree completely with Ernest on that. This is a case in which it's more important to get it right than to have it done fast.
Did you?
Yeah, I think that one thing for the family's point of view, I'm struck by an image. We had a vigil outside the White House during the White House Christmas party, which I was told we were the first people ever to demonstrate outside the White House Christmas party. And it was a silent vigil. And some people had no idea who we were, even though we held up little signs. Some of them had obviously probably had a few pre-parties and said some inappropriate things, even challenging if we were, quote, real 9/11 family members. I haven't figured out what that means yet. I think I am. But one senator came up to us and said, it's not going to be the best bill possible, but it's going to be the best possible bill. And that's the way we had to look at it. And obviously, we would have liked it to be better too, but the question was, it goes back to the day when you guys announced the report to us, and one of your colleagues said, people are going to criticize this, but the worst thing to do is nothing. So let's get this, and let's get if other people have other ideas, that's great, but let's get something happening, because 3 years is long enough. And I think that all 9/11 families definitely feel that way.
Well, let me push all three of you on that then. So something happens, not to minimum, but so you have the Intelligence Reform Act. If there's one or two things that you can change about intelligence reform writ large, whatever it is, I mean, what would it be? What didn't you get that you were willing to give up, either for unanimity or for the politics of getting something done?
Well, I'm not sure that it's even right to put it, what did we give up? We weren't the lawmakers, but Ernest has pointed out, if you look at the parameters of the bill itself and what it covered, the greatest backing off from our recommendations were the express powers of the Director of National Intelligence. And that's why in a couple months, the members of the commission are probably going to give Congress a report card. I'd say probably on executive reform, maybe they get a B+. But if we took the broader part of it, we'd say they did almost nothing with respect to reforming Congress's own oversight, either of intelligence activities or of the Department of Homeland Security. In our book, we say, for example, that the Department of Homeland Security has to report to 88 congressional committees and subcommittees. I don't know why anyone would want to be secretary of that department. They'd spend all their time in Congress. I think it's our belief now that with the modest changes they've made, the number is 79. We wanted it to be one, a joint committee of the two houses of Congress. So there's the criticism within the parameters of the bill, and then the whole area that they haven't covered at all.
Yeah,
Can I chime in on just because I think that's, you ask about the one thing, and the one thing I would want done was the change in the congressional setup for intelligence. If Congress had seized this and had really united the intelligence oversight function, then in some ways the Director of National Intelligence would be automatic. They would have to have such a person in order to present a consolidated program to them, in just the way in which, independently what the President wanted, after Congress in 1946 had consolidated the military affairs and naval affairs committees, they had to have something like a Secretary of Defense. Now that's an office that evolved and changed its definition, and this wouldn't be the case here, but it's going to be very, very difficult. And it would be much easier if Congress had already changed.
I agree. It was amazing to me. The bill was signed on December 17th, and so we went to the bill signing, and we went to your ceremony, and then we met with Representative Cox, who's the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee in the House. So automatically, a week before Christmas, we were already starting on our next advocacy efforts. And that was for the Rules Committee to change who was going to report to Homeland Security. And so we came back in early January, went back down to DC, and tried to get them to change the rules so that more people would be reporting to Homeland Security, and we lost. So cybersecurity, for example, doesn't report to Homeland Security. And it was pretty disheartening because at this point now, it's almost 3.5 years later, you have to think, how can this possibly be our government? They had this big chart, it looked like a big spider web with all the different committee structures and how people were reporting to who and what, and it's the most confusing thing you've ever seen. And basically, for the families, we want accountability. And that's why something like the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, is such a good thing to us, because there is someone who we can look to work with to make things better. But under this current structure, there's no accountability.
Well, I want to, there's accountability up and accountability down. And one of the great features of the DNI is that you're now effectively going to have one person advising the president, presumably with all of the facts and knowledge necessary to do that. We can be as partisan as we want, and I'm a very partisan Republican, but I think Bill Clinton got terrible advice during his entire presidency. Just from one section, and somehow or other, you might start way down in the CIA with someone saying, well, we've got an 80% chance of getting bin Laden in thus and such a time and place. And the supervisor would say 60%, and the director of counterintelligence would say 40%, and by the time it got to Clinton, it was 20%. And what are you going to do under those circumstances? And the FBI director during the whole Clinton administration and Clinton didn't get along, so they never met. And so the FBI information was getting to the president indirectly through the CIA. And in the DNI, you're going to have one person who, if that person is effective, is going to have all of the relevant information and will have the responsibility to the President of the United States, and so that there can be a real accountability, which there has not been in the past.
You talk about one of the issues that you recommend that was discussed for a little bit when the report came out, and then Congress has sort of gone its way. there's actually an entire chapter that has almost gotten very little play, maybe in the academy and in some discussions, and that's the chapter 12 issues, the what to do a global strategy. So right, so you think of intel reform, and that's sort of getting a new position and reforming some of the structures, but chapter 12 comes before all that, right? The sort of global strategy for whatever you want to call it, but I'll call it the war on terrorism because we know what I mean when I say that. So I'm curious what's your explanation for that part of the commission report? I don't want to say it sort of fell by the sideline. It just seems so hard for people to grasp. But on the other hand, the commission, and I think certainly the families, felt that that was probably as important as the structural changes. So, and the chapter 12 issues are barely discussed.
Well, we really, there are sort of three sets of recommendations on what to do. And I think you're primarily talking about the second of those. The first is rather precise. Mm-hmm. When you're dealing with the terrorists, you go after them where they are. That it is a war, and you better get them before they get you. Well, however one wants to debate that part of our foreign policy, at least it's rather precise. Yeah. And then the third level of that was restructure the way the things you're doing here at home for the defense mechanisms, whether they're aircraft security or the reorganization of intelligence activities and the like. And those are things that can be done, at least the structures can be created by executive orders and by acts of Congress. You can't, that doesn't necessarily get you better people, but it allows good people to have more scope, to do their job better. That middle one is a more amorphous foreign policy recommendation about how do you fight for hearts and minds. And it's vitally important, but I think it's clearly the most difficult with the philosophy with which you're dealing. We did a pretty good job of that during the Cold War, and we pretty much abandoned that at this point. And I think I'll turn it over to Ernest because I think he was as responsible as anyone else for writing up that part of it. And incidentally, he didn't write it with 80 people.
That's what it says in his bio.
Philip Zellicoe and Ernest May wrote the report that almost got us the National Book Club report. Now, they wrote in it the policy prescriptions and even the arguments over history that the commissioners wanted, but even when we made up our mind on something, they wrote it. And they did a marvelous job. And of course, we were unanimous because we left opinions to the reader, didn't express opinions ourselves. One of the commissioners said, we wrote a report without adjectives. And there is one of the people who was the most responsible for it.
Sorry, flattered by that, I've lost the question.
The hearts and minds
the hearts
issue.
And minds.
As part of intelligence, as a part of the intelligence reform, what next? We know how to do the war, and we know how to do the restructuring.
The part of the answer to your question is that it's so much easier to focus on organizational proposals. That they're there, you can do it or not do it. And it's the recommendations in this domain, what Slade says is the second domain, have to do with priorities, with approaches, with the way in which you deal with people, and it isn't something you can prescribe and say you do exactly this. I've been very pleased with this short tenure of Secretary Rice because it seems to me that what she's been saying and doing is as nearly consistent with the recommendations in that report as I could imagine it being. But taking that first proposition that you have to attack terrorists, but saying, as the report does, that it can't be done just by us. It has to be a collective effort. It has to be a collective effort that involves people in the regions and not just our traditional allies, but our traditional allies as well. And we seem to be moving, to some degree, in that direction.
Another issue in terms of the 911 Commission and sort of the intelligence reform is, I have to be honest with you, for those of us who are lawyers in national security, what one might call the punt about the civil liberties, civil rights debate. I mean that in a report this long, there's 2 or 3 pages. Now, I can have my own theory about unanimity, but since the war on terrorism began, you have detentions, Abu Ghraib, other issues that have come up about how America conducts itself against both foreigners and its own citizens. Did unanimity, this will be the challenge for our democracy, right? Is sort of, as we continue this war, how do we do it in a way that's consistent with our own norms? I think everyone can agree with that. But the report says so little about it in terms of the specifics, where you're quite specific about everything else. Was that unanimity? Was it?
Well, first, here today, and ever since we finished on the 22nd of July, the overwhelming attention of the country, quite appropriately, has been on our recommendations and the degree to which they're going to be adopted. But I would hazard the guess, not knowing exactly how much time every staffer spent on it, but I'd hazard the guess that 80% of our time and effort was expended in writing the history and trying to get it right, because 10 or 50 years from now, whatever has happened to the recommendations will be on to something else. But we hope that the history that we wrote will still be the basic history of the event, and that historians can build on it, they can interpret it, and the like as they will. But it was very heavily skewed in that direction, and the statute that created us was to a certain extent skewed in that direction. And we were 5 partisan Republicans and 5 partisan Democrats. I think most of us felt almost from the beginning that if we did it right, we could be unanimous on the history. I think we surprised ourselves when we were unanimous on the recommendations, because reasonable people can differ with some of them. But pardoning your introduction, this isn't the beginning any more than it's the end. The beginning was 9/11 itself. And we had a war in Afghanistan, and Congress passed the Patriot Act, and it created a Department of Homeland Security. We came in the midst of that, and I think provided an additional degree of emphasis, but we were in the middle of it. And the Patriot Act is highly controversial. But only 2 parts of the Patriot Act really applied to our writing the history. And they had to do with ending the wall that seemed to prevent FBI people even from talking to FBI people, much less CIA people, and the use of grand jury information. And so we said, okay, those 2 parts of the Patriot Act we think ought to be renewed and made permanent. But for the rest, and looking at the future, first, we never would have agreed if we had had to go through the whole Patriot Act and critique how it was being implemented, and it wasn't in our charge anyway. So I think we set out a good rule, both for Congress and for people who are looking at it. And that is that the burden of proof is on the government, on whoever proposes any change with respect to these policies, to show with very, very substantial evidence that the good they do in preventing terrorism, their actual effect in making the American people safer, vastly outweighs any limitation on individual rights. And we can't tell exactly what the proposals are going to be, so what we attempted to do was say, here's the test to which you ought to subject them.
Let me just pick up on what Slade said at the beginning, because it certainly is true that the focus of the commission was on getting the history right. And that's one of the things that distinguished this commission from every other commission I know of, that they really did think what we're going to do is write a report that will be as nearly definitive account of this episode as can be provided, that will be read, used in schools by our grandchildren. And that focus then affected the recommendations, partly because the commission got to the recommendations It was at the end of the book. So
Right.
but also because there was a strong inclination within the commission and the staff to be sure that there was a linkage between the story and the recommendations. So that one of the reasons, there are others, but one of the reasons why you don't get much emphasis on the civil liberties issue is that was not part of the story of 9/11. That's mostly something that comes up afterward, and we didn't deal with that, or didn't deal much with that. So we didn't try to ignore everything that had happened after 9/11. It would have been silly to do so, but we did try to think at least, or what we're proposing, either in the policy realm or organizational realm, does that have some sort of root in the story of 9/11?
Carrie, before I get to the last question for all three of you, I wanted to ask you, there's a moment that the senator describes where you're briefed, the families are briefed, right before you go public in that amazing press conference to discuss the report. You're told it's unanimous. Did you know then, I mean, there were clearly things that you wanted more of. And if you could talk a little bit, given the 9/11 families, certainly, you know, I'm sure you're not as unified as you all appear on TV, but certainly, what was that moment like as you think about, are we going to support what this commission has done? We wanted them, they didn't do everything we wanted, or we wanted them to do more. I just wanted to pick up on that a little bit because I think that might be an interesting thing for people to hear, because you all had a choice, and presumably there were differences of opinion.
Well, I think the first thing that we did, which I think surprised you guys, was got you to sign our books, which lightened the mood a little bit. You felt like a little rock star celebrity.
Yes.
The autographs. You know, we hadn't read the report, and we didn't want to go and say we support something or don't support something that we hadn't even read to be legitimate. So I think that day, I'm trying to remember exactly what our message was that basically we wanted to see action take place, and we needed to look more thoroughly. But I think for us, we were in a little bit of a quandary because we could have done a couple of things. One is we could have said, this report stinks. It doesn't deal with financing. It doesn't deal with why Giuliani locked away his records in New York City and what to do with that. I mean, there's a whole slew of things it doesn't deal with, but where would that have gotten us? And I don't think it would have gotten us very far at all. We could have said we agree with some and not the others, but I don't think that the media or the national American people could understand the differences until they'd really read it. And quite honestly, while it's a bestseller, I'm wondering how many of you have actually read the whole thing. I think a lot of people have. It's a big book. So I think that we decided on the last option, which is we're going to support this, and because it has a lot of great changes in it, and then we'll go from there. So I think we're at the going from there part now, which is what doesn't it have? What does it have that hasn't gotten done? I think looking into foreign aid and all of these big picture items are not going to take 6 months to change. It's going to take a lot longer than that. So that's where we're regrouping now and trying to figure out what to do, because I think at the end of the day, I can only speak for myself, but I think most of the families I know, we want accountability, but we want to make sure what happened to our loved ones is not in vain, that their murders was not in vain, and that we make this country a safer place, but also the world a better place where there's not this hatred, which sounds a little rosy and fuzzy, but I think that that's what's really driving most people. Not a lot of anger, not a lot of frustration, but really wanting to make something out of it.
This is they really got a lesson in political science. This is a very sophisticated group of people. They're great. They know, a lot of good thinking.
So before we get to questions and answers, I did want to ask this final question, which is, despite everything that you recommend and the fact that it was recently passed, and there has been no attack on U.S. soil. There's been a lot going on abroad, but no attack on U.S. soil since September 11th. And I don't know if anyone has a good answer for it, but it would be helpful to have that discussion, because maybe the answer is the war in Afghanistan did a lot, or the war in Iraq did a lot, or maybe the answer is we have a lot more surveillance going on. But it does raise a question, why hasn't there been? And how do you answer that question? I mean, maybe we got it right again. Maybe we don't need all these changes.
Well, there are two absolute facts, or groups of facts. One you've outlined. There has not been another successful terrorist attack inside the United States. Two, there have been a lot of successful terrorist attacks in other parts of the world. The logical conclusion from those two facts is that we have not ended terrorism, but that we have displaced it. Getting rid of Afghanistan as a huge training ground, an extreme safe training ground, has probably made fairly elaborate plans, certainly, if not impossible, certainly more difficult. And so you just send, to a certain extent, the terrorists have gone after easier targets. Because we did do a lot of things. Obviously, aircraft security became tighter after 9/11. Obviously, the attitude of our institutions, both defense and intelligence, have become better since then. But we haven't won that war for hearts and minds by any stretch of the imagination. And we say this is a struggle that's going to last for decades, not years. And I'm absolutely convinced that that is the case. But I think it is really important, and I know every member of the commission, and I think every member of its staff believe the fact that we have been safe for the last 3 years does not mean that it's over. And I think all of us would have to predict that at some time there'll be another attack in the United States that creates some real disruption and some real and some real casualties, because you can be right 999 times out of 1,000 if you're operating defensively, and still perhaps the 1,000th one gets through. But the partial answer to your question is we're doing a better job now than we did before. But we're sure not doing a perfect job.
Yeah, kind of being someone who was sort of struck by lightning and everything is going to happen to you, but it does. I think that for us, we think it's just a matter of time, mostly because we're told that over and over again. We're not safe yet, but we're safer. I remember a few weeks after my mom was murdered, getting in touch with the Pan Am 103 families and hearing from them how awful it was for them that no one had listened and no one had made a lot of the changes that they felt could have saved 3,000 people. At that time, it was more, they were predicting 10,000 people, such as hardening cockpit doors, because the airlines lobbied against it, because they didn't want to pay $1 million a plane, which they ended up having to do now anyway, but in the interim, my mom was murdered. So I think for us, that we're sort of frantic in terms of trying to do everything that we can to make sure that we're stopping it from these recommendations and from other things. The aviation security monograph, I don't believe it's out yet from the commission. So the commission's still not done. There's still more information. There's so much more work to be done, even in just preparedness. Interesting for us is that the Red Cross didn't know how to deal with September 11th. They took all in all this money. They didn't know what to do. Most people probably thought that they're paying for mental health for the families. That's just not true. I don't ever want to see another victim of terrorism not get their mental health paid for, and I will fight till the end to make sure that that's the case. We weren't able to do it September 11th, but I hope we are for whatever, God forbid, there's another one. So I think for us, we are sort of waiting a little because we do think it's going to come. But while I do believe that there are excellent analysts, people working in the CIA and the FBI trying to protect us every single day, I don't think that they alone can do their jobs. And until there's accountability, until people recognize all the threats and actually make the changes, which are tough, which means they might lose their Senate seat, they might lose their House seat. And I don't see that happening in all cases. I don't think that we're going to be able to prevent it.
I think, Juliet, that part of the answer can be found in the pages of that report. That is, if you look at what we know about Al-Qaeda, they're very patient, they're very professional. They took a long time to prepare 9/11. The thing that drives them, that makes them impatient, is their need for recruits and for funds, so that they'll do things that create some publicity that enable them to recruit. But that doesn't have to be in the United States. And I don't think that there's anything in the story of 9/11 that gives you a lot of comfort about the future, other than the kind of thing that Slade was mentioning. Do you think that they were very careful about the airline security measures that were enforced then? They looked at them, they figured out how they could get past, have knives that were just the right length to get past the gates. And it's a little harder for them to think about using planes now, so that buys us some time.
We're going to open it up to question and answers now. It's, if you could, there's 4 microphones. If you could introduce yourself, if your question is directed towards one of the panelists, please mention them, but anyone can answer. And if you can ask just one brief question, would be wonderful. So I'll start here.
Hi. Hello. Chris Beck, student here. Some of the discussion after 9/11, some of the critiques have been that the public has not been asked to make many great sacrifices. There's been, instead of enacting taxes to pay for some of the homeland security remedies and anti-terrorism remedies, there's been no new revenue generated. I'm wondering if in any of this process the commission or the families even thought about trying to engage the public and the Congress and the administration on new funding mechanisms to pay for all the things that we need to do.
Well, the simple answer to that question is no. That wasn't our, that wasn't our charge, and we didn't do it. We recommended specific things that ought to be done, but how they were going to do about it or how financing was beyond our charge.
I would say when they bailed out the airlines with $15 billion in cash and loan guarantees, they created the Victim Compensation Fund because they took away, they limited the liability of the airlines. So we fought to get that fund to be more fair because they basically limited the value of human life from $2.8 million to $250,000, which is coincidentally enough the same number that people who are into tort reform are now touting. We tried to fight against that and were labeled greedy, and I can't even tell you the amount of negative, very negative emails that we received, amongst other things. We are not going to fight for a tax increase. I think that our advocacy efforts were strained enough, but it's an interesting point.
Charles Cogan, Kennedy School. I have read this report from cover to cover, and I think it's great. But I'd like to comment on one of the recommendations that was made in the report that paramilitary operations be shifted to the Pentagon. And then somewhat contradictorily, later in the report, it says that that doesn't mean the CIA should get out of paramilitary operations and that each side, that is the Pentagon and the CIA, should play to its strengths and work together. But my question is, what was the rationale in leaving this off the table of the bill that went before the Congress? I understand that the President has tossed the problem back to the Pentagon and the CIA and said, you work it out in the next 90 days. But why didn't the 9/11 Commission try to get this into the bill?
I'm not sure that I can answer that precisely and accurately. The 9/11 Commission did not write a bill. The 9/11 Commission made these recommendations, which in some cases are quite specific, but they weren't in the language of a congressional bill. Those bills were written by congressional staff in the initial instance in the Senate. For reasons that I talked about earlier, the Senate was much more receptive to what we had done, and Senators Frist and Daschle, literally on the day we came out with our report, picked a committee headed by Senator Collins and Senator Lieberman, which was going to be the most bipartisan committee in the Senate to do the work. They actually hired a couple of our staff to be staff on that, but they made the policy decisions as to what was going to be included in the bill and what was not going to be included in the bill. I think I can give you a little bit of that rationale for the frustration of members of the commission with the fact that there was some overlap in special forces and the armed services and the CIA. Maybe the greatest illustration of that struggle had to do with the Predator, the drone plane that first it may very well have spotted bin Laden when it was just out there as a spotter plane, and then was withdrawn for the winter, and we attempted, we were arming it. One of the things that kept that drone from flying again before 9/11 was a bitter argument between the CIA and the Air Force over who would pay the $5 million if one of them got shot down. Just this terrible argument that slowed down the whole process. We were just wildly frustrated with that proposition. And I think we thought, and maybe we didn't even think it out completely, that if you just had one entity that was in charge of doing all of this thing, you'd remove one more excuse for inaction.
I'm sorry, up here.
I'm Ari Rubin. I'm a student at the college. My question is primarily for Ms. Lamack. One of the greatest issues remaining, the greatest post 9/11 issues remaining, is the funding discrepancy. Speaking of funding before, because I come from New York State, and from everything I've read, New York State is the primary target of terror, but states like Montana and Alaska, because they have powerful senators on powerful committees, seem to be getting much more funding per person, Homeland Security funding per person. What steps is your organization going to take to remedy this?
Well, it was part of the bill, and it's in the 9/11 Commission report. We fought for it. We want it to be based on a threat assessment, as I'm understanding that you do too. We'll keep fighting. The thing is, it's difficult because at this point in time, 3.5 years later, pork barrel politics have come back, if they ever went away. And we have to fight that fight. If you want to help us, we'd be happy to have you.
It's you're right. We made a recommendation that the state and local assistance be need-based, but it's a part of our system that every square inch of the United States is represented by someone in both the House and in the Senate. And when we speak here or in Washington, D.C., and I've spoken all over, or in New York, that's an immensely popular idea. I spent 2 days making this speech in Alaska, and they were not very impressed with that point. And they say, well, we're the closest to Asia, and it's easier for missiles to hit us, and there are all kinds of Air Force bases up here and the like, and besides, we got a senator who's going to protect us.
Austin Long, I'm a grad student at MIT. In reading the commission report, there seem to be two basic theories of why 9/11 happened. There's a failure of imagination and a failure of coordination. So you create the position of a director of national intelligence to increase coordination. But I wondered if the commission had thought about that perhaps having a tension with imagination, right? How are you going to generate alternative analysis, alternative hypotheses, when, as the senator pointed out, you have one person representing all intelligence to the president? So I wondered if Professor May and Senator Gordon had some thoughts on that. Is there a tension between the two?
There's potentially a tension, but not. It isn't necessarily the case. And there's no reason to suppose that the new director would have difficulty in commissioning alternative assessments or in listening to them in the process of giving advice to the president. And indeed, it's arguable that the current system, even though the DCI is the person who goes and briefs the president, he doesn't hear a lot of what's done in the DIA. He certainly doesn't hear what's done in the FBI. Is not able to bring that to the table. So the possibility of listening to alternative views and really bringing them together in the White House, I think, is considerably enhanced by this.
You've put your finger right on a vitally important point. You can write legislation that reorganizes the way in which government structures work. It's very difficult to write legislation to create imagination. And we talk a little bit about how you recruit people into positions that like this. In World War II, when the OSS started out, the brightest and best went into it, but they went into it for the duration of the war. They weren't going to stay there in most cases for their careers. And we also sometimes penalize imagination. Something goes wrong, and then there's a congressional hearing, and people get blamed for it. And it's awfully easy in an institution like the CIA to create a very, very risk-averse culture. And essentially, that is what we have done. And so I think about the best we can say is that we've tried to design a structure in which when imagination is actually encouraged and when it's present, it can be used, and the results of that imagination can get upstairs to the people who have to make decisions on the information that they have, So the two are related. Quite a number of things happened before 9/11 that no one ever heard about. The FBI director was never informed that the FBI in Minneapolis had arrested this guy Moussaoui, who was a suspicious character. The fact of all of this training going on in Arizona, never got to anyone who could actually do anything with it. Other pieces of vital information were treated as routine information. Answer in 30 days, 15 days before 9/11. There were some awfully good people, operating at various levels, whose imaginations, the product of whose imagination never got to people who had to make a decision.
And the principal illustration that is given in the report of the failure of imagination is the failure to anticipate the possibility of the use of aircraft as weapons. And the argument that's made in the report is that this is not something that calls for peculiarly imaginative different people. It's saying that there was some institutionalized ways of imaginative thinking that had been developed to look at the Soviet threat. And it simply was not applied. The whole system of thinking about warning was discarded in this area. So it's not, it isn't calling for a new type of person or even a new type of organization. It's calling for doing, in many circumstances, what people have learned painfully hard how to do.
Yes, my name is Nelson Lees. I'm a mid-career MPA student here at the school. Leaning down a little bit, 6'6" doesn't do it with these average-sized mics. I'd first of all, like to thank you all for sharing your thoughts and candid observations with us this evening. It couldn't be more timely and relevant topic. And just to underscore a point that was made just before the Q&A, those of us in the audience and up in the rafters who are starting to have the benefit of what the Kennedy School is all about in terms of learn a little bit more about security, terrorism, and intelligence. No question about the fact that jihadist terrorists really have two categories of enemies and threats, and they just call them the near enemy and the far enemy. And as long as we're on this soil, we're going to be the far enemy. No ifs, ands, or buts about that. So what happens over the next few months is critically important to us, despite the fact that we all agree we've been very fortunate up to this point. I'd like to have I think this is a quick question addressed to the Senator, and I've talked to Kerry a little bit about this offline. I don't know whether I'm any happier from an oversight perspective with one combined Senate-Congress oversight committee or 79 down from 88, because from an oversight perspective, the Congress has dropped the ball big time. And I'd challenge anybody in the audience, anybody on the dais this evening to point out where that they have not let the citizens of this country down. How can you raise my comfort level as a future public sector policymaker trying to make a difference when I get out of this school, that oversight is going to be taken seriously from now on in this critical area where we have an administration that will throw the ball back to the CIA and the Pentagon and say, you work it out. Well, that's not the answer. And you don't have to go beyond 101 to know that.
Well, the answer is I can't give you that. Assurance, and I'm not certain that I could give you that assurance if our total recommendations had been adopted. What I can tell you, from an experience of 18 years being there, is that the number of members who are really interested in this subject is fairly small, and there's a high degree of justification for that. If you're spending a significant amount of your time on this kind of hands-on oversight, that's time you're not spending on things that your constituents know that you're doing, and really are holding you accountable for doing. And the frustration of present members, one of my closest friends in the Senate is Pat Roberts, who's the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, who does pay a lot of attention to it, has worked very hard since he's been chairman. And he's just as frustrated as all get out. He and his committee spent most of last year coming up with an intelligence authorization bill, which under the present rules then has to go to the Armed Services Committee before it can even go to the floor. And one senator can put a hold on it so it doesn't pass at all. And you end up having worked for the better part of the year, and the results of doing it are zero. Just absolutely zero. I would say, literally, if you got 9 members of a 100-member Senate who really cared enough about this subject to work on it hard, you would be in wonderful shape. But you will never get 9 members to work on it hard unless the decisions they made can actually be carried out. And that's the reason we wanted the consolidation. Bluntly, those 79 committee chairmen, now that's in Homeland Security, but it's closely related. What's the value of that to an individual? Well, that chairman can hold a hearing, and he can call the television cameras to the hearing. And he or she can ask all kinds of probing questions and can rant and rave and make a good news conference out of it. But generally speaking, they can't do anything about it. They don't have any real authority. They're not going to be able to pass a bill. They occupy a lot of the time of the people who are running these agencies, but the net, the net result is almost zero. I served on the Senate Intelligence Committee for 2 years. I was on it during the Gulf War. I quit. It was a total waste of time as far as I was concerned. Basically, I almost never learned anything I didn't read in the Washington Post within 48 hours anyway. And I never felt that I was having any real impact on the process. And a lot of that was because of that structure. And Bob Kerrey, one of the other former senator who was on the commission, he had spent a number of years on it. He was the vice chairman of the committee. And as Ernest knows, he was just driven up the wall by his great interest in it and his inability to make that interest effective. A recommendation we made that the Senate adopted was to make the intelligence budget public. Didn't get in the final bill, the House opposed it. And Bob Kerry's great story is, he said, if I said the intelligence budget was $40 billion, I was committing a crime. But if I said, if Tom Clancy is right, the intelligence budget is $40 billion, that was perfectly okay. But you're not going to get very many members who want to deal with that level of frustration, and that's why we wanted it closed in.
But if you do, let us know.
Yeah.
Because, it might shock people to know that, we talk about the 9/11 families. There were roughly 12 of us who worked to get the commission passed and worked on it. Obviously, we had help from a lot of people, and we couldn't have done it without them. Well, the numbers dwindled, and at the meeting to talk about congressional oversight, there were 2 of us. So we could use some help. So I'll volunteer. Yeah.
I think that's it. I want to thank our panel members for an amazing discussion. Professor May, Carrie, Senator Gorton, whose whole family is here, I guess, or parts of them. Thank you very much, and thank you all for joining us.
Oh, great job, Terry.
Thank you.
It's wonderful to see you again.
You often have supper.
Good. Yes.